Today's episode is brought to you by HERdacity. HERdacity is a nonprofit inspiring confidence in women to achieve their professional goals. For resources, networking opportunities, and a strong community of women, visit HERdacity.org to learn more.
Welcome to HERdacious, a podcast for audacious women. Hello, everyone. I'm Lorelei, and you have tuned into HERdacious. I am so glad you were able to join us today. Now, we are going to be discussing how to combat self-doubt with mindfulness. And I know that mindfulness has been kind of a buzzword, and we're going to really get into what that is and how that can really help you personally and professionally. Joining me in this conversation is mental wellness expert and owner of Recalibrate, a mental wellness service provider, Miss Gloria Chan Packer. Hello, Gloria.
Hi, how are you doing?
I am most excellent.
Great.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It is my absolute pleasure. So, Gloria, you created a whole company around the concept of mindfulness.
Yep.
Why?
Great question. Let me access my ability to be concise to give you the Reader's Digest version. Essentially, I spent 8 years in management consulting, working for Fortune 500 clients and kind of doing a decently classic consulting, corporate leadership career. I loved my career and found a lot of fulfillment in it, but had a lot of tendencies of overstressing myself and creating more stress for myself that I really wasn't conscious of. And it took until late in my career, it was in summer of 17, where I started really struggling with chronic migraines and had a medical battle that forced me onto short-term disability.
Whoa.
Which as kind of an independent woman who is used to being in leadership roles and kind of proving things wrong, right? Having to go out of work was devastating for me. The fast forward bright side of that story now is that it really forced me to pause and educate myself a lot more on truly the body-brain science of everyday mental wellness practices when it comes to things we all experience like stress and anxiety, which in my opinion, up until very recently, we kind of stigmatized as, well, this is something wrong with me if I'm struggling, right? And if I'm not managing and powering through crazy busyness and stress, then I'm not worthy because everyone else is.
You're not tough enough.
Exactly. To where still right now, I think it's changing, but definitely at that point when I was thinking about starting Recalibrate, I felt like we lived in a society where we wore stress as a badge of honor, where you wear busy as a badge of honor.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I worked a 12-hour day.
Exactly. I didn't eat lunch.
Oh, yeah. I totally forgot I was so busy.
Yeah. And then we stigmatize slowing down and taking care of ourselves and even talking about the ways that our brains work, right? And it's an unsustainable model that I lived that I think a lot of my peers have or are still living. And I felt very strongly that if we could provide better education and better tools when it comes to our mental wellness, that especially us high analytical, high achiever types could do a lot better for ourselves. And so that's how Recalibrate was founded, really wanting to provide a more modern and science-backed approach to mental wellness for busy professionals.
Most excellent. Well, we have a lot of busy professionals listening to us today. So I'm really excited to be able to share the information and the tools that you'll have for us to put into practice in our everyday lives. So let's talk about doubt. Let's talk about how we build up the resiliency to overcome things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we start?
Yeah. Let's start with the resilience piece. So that's the end goal for a lot of us, right? Is to build better resilience. And at the core, resilience is the ability to combat hardship and to come back better, stronger with growth, etc. Where doubt gets very much in the way of having resilience is that doubt and criticism and imposter syndrome, believing that we cannot. When we really lean into those beliefs and truly take them on and have all of our choices be fueled by kind of the underlying belief that I am not enough, or I cannot, or failure is not an option, then we become incredibly overwhelmed by anxiety and fear of failure. And if we are scared to fail, we'll never really put ourselves up for anything outside of our comfort zone. And if you never step outside of your comfort zone, you never fall, you never learn a new lesson, where you're kind of just living a lot of your days on loop within a certain routine, within a certain comfort zone, because it becomes too psychologically scary to take on something big or new. And so very much, in a way, self-doubt, self-criticism, and imposter syndrome, when it becomes too pervasive, it negates our ability to build resilience at all, because it negates any opportunity to put ourselves up for failure, which you need as a key ingredient for resilience.
Absolutely. I spent about 5 years in the behavioral health sector, and another one of those words is negative self-talk,
Yeah.
where you talk crap to yourself, like,
Yep.
that's not good enough, that wasn't amazing enough, I need to try
Yeah.
harder,
Yes.
look at them, they're doing better than me, the
Mhm.
comparison, those nasty, nagging little messages we tell
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yep.
So how does self-criticism hinder us professionally?
When it comes to self-criticism, we really want to watch the level of kind of productivity for ourselves, right? And how much our self-criticism mirrors true reality outside of ourselves. When we are engaging in observations of shortcomings that might be true, right? That is healthy recognition. When we go past that into saying that it's all my fault, I'm the worst, I can't do this, people are going to find me out, that's when the self-talk starts to fall out of what reality is. And it is what gets us farther and farther from reality, right? And not only that, it further disempowers us from doing something about changing our outcome, because we become more and more disconnected from what reality is. When we can engage in self-talk that helps us plan and create solutions, then that's really healthy. But when we engage in self-talk that becomes repetitive and ruminating, where it kind of sets us up to be helpless, that becomes really unproductive.
That makes me think of, all those times you had that cool, quirky comeback and you didn't say it and you leave the conversation and you're like, oh, I should have said this. And you just think about it over and over again and you get more and more frustrated at
Yeah.
yourself and you get down on yourself.
Yeah.
Everybody does that.
Yeah.
How do we stop that? Oh my goodness.
One I think is just having the awareness of catching yourself is the first step. Saying, okay, I'm having a ruminating thought right now. And then asking yourself a second accountability question of, is this helping me or am I ruminating? Is there something I can do about this right now? Or am I literally replaying something over and over in my head? Also, when we're asking ourselves if we can do something about it too, kind of checking on if that's really productive and relevant and needed, right? Because going with that example of, I could have said this witty thing, you could technically say, well, I should just text someone and be like, oh yeah, I really wanted to say this pithy thing, right? Not
Yes.
necessarily productive or relevant.
Or helpful.
Really, yeah, really rooted in something deeper. And that's kind of where a lot of the mindfulness tool set comes in that I wanted to talk about later, but I'll make that kind of a teaser.
Thank you. So you just mentioned that challenge being rooted in something deeper. That seems to me like seeking control, like wanting to be in control.
Yeah.
In control of your person, your message, your brand, your everything,
Yeah.
the people around you, how they perceive you. I mean, that
Yeah.
can spiral
Yes.
on and on, right?
Yeah. That just brings up, I think, an important delineation that you've probably worked with in your behavioral health past, right? Where probably in the last decade or so, we were a little bit obsessed with the concept of self-esteem. And they've started realizing that there are aspects of self-esteem that become unproductive and can kind of fuel what has become a craze around lack of self-compassion, self-doubt, self-criticism, et cetera, where when we break down self-esteem, right, it's either feeling worthy or feeling unworthy, right? And feeling worthy in and of itself is not bad. That's can be really, really good for our psyche. Feeling unworthy is not good for our psyche. What has manifested, however, is that our feelings of worthiness have become, both by society and many of our upbringings, our feeling of worthiness has become contingent on external factors, many of which are comparison-based, where all of a sudden our self-worth becomes dependent on our comparison of us against others and us needing to be above average or better than everyone else in order to feel worthy. We can go through like the whole history of kind of why, but I think a lot of us feel and remember that, right? Whether it's parents that told us that we had to be better and punished us because we weren't, or on the flip side, parents who told us over and over again that we were special, and our brains associated that with parental love and caretaking equals I need to be special, right? It's a reward. So it's two flip sides of reward and punishment. Both cases, we're seeking being special and above average. And because that's become decently hardwired into our brains, we seek our self-worth in the comparison of ourselves against others. And when that's the form of psychological safety you're seeking, we'll start to see things kind of fall apart and erode, where we need to passive aggressively put down other people, or where with kids, right, there's bullying, right? Because it's the seeking of making myself feel bigger. The other aspect of that becomes unproductive too is it's a framework that is one-sided. It's not very flexible, where if we think that our self-worth is built upon being better than those around us, or it's grounded in succeeding or the money, the career success, whatever, that's very one-sided and means that when we ultimately fail or fall down, that's unacceptable, and that we don't have a tool or a framework for that. So then we start to just avoid all of that together, which ends up putting not only our brain in a really rough place, but has us limiting our own self-growth. It has us twisting our perception of things. It has us seeking behaviors and relationships that are things that we feel like we can control, or that we can control the perception of, et cetera, right? And it slides quickly into narcissism, but we don't have to touch on that today.
Oof. That does sound like a big topic.
Yeah.
Well, you were mentioning comparison. That made me think of the confidence gap. I'm sure you have probably seen the stat where it talks about people applying for jobs based on meeting a percentage of qualifications.
Yeah.
And I find those numbers really challenging. On average, men can look at a job posting, and if they meet 60% of the qualifications, they'll apply for it. Whereas their female counterparts feel, need that they have to meet 100% of those qualifications before they feel confident enough to apply for them.
Right.
That is like mind-blowing. And it's really sad that on the whole, women in general don't have the confidence to go out and get a job that they are probably very, very qualified for, and only need one or two maybe adjustments in their skill set,
right,
to really bloom inside of a position.
Yeah. Between women and men, right? Both women and men, I think, struggle with things like self-doubt and imposter syndrome, but it is rough to see where certain gender biases really play into that for women, because I think we've discussed a lot more in society now, thankfully, that men, boys, when they grow up, we kind of culturally surround them with values of it is good to take risks. It is good to take risks to the point that you're rule breaking. That means you are brave, you are courageous, you are taking the bull by the horns. Whereas for a girl, if you break rules, that means you're not listening. If you stand up for that, you're defiant, or you're being too much.
Or bossy.
Yes, exactly. Or you're bossy, intimidating, blah, blah, blah. And you see that, right, in statistics like that confidence gap, where there are so many learned thoughts, perceptions, reactions that we have based on everything from our upbringing to what social roles we end up owning in childhood to adulthood, to all of our life experiences and the constant messaging we're getting around us, and how we perceive that and internalize it. And so for so many women, because it feels like you have to be perfect in order to take a risk, or that you already have it before you say that you do, because God forbid if you go up for this role and get caught not being fully qualified, then they will call you out
Imposter!
Yeah, exactly. They will call you out as the woman who was too full of herself, who lied.
You're the woman who was too full of yourself,
Exactly.
not the person
Yeah, and
or
I
the
think
applicant.
there's even, again, this is changing, thank goodness, but I think there's still so much social stuff too, right? Where if a man even gets caught doing that, right? The reality of even getting caught being an imposter for a man, I think, is potentially a little bit more psychologically safe than for a woman, because other men will rally around him and be like, you took a chance. You were just trying to make a jump. And I think many women would get behind that too, right? But then when it comes to women, oh goodness, you can think of other women bashing other women immediately, right? Being like, she was full of herself. She's a narcissist, which is a word we throw around misappropriately all the time because we assume it's someone who has self-confidence, but it's actually someone who doesn't and keeps making up for it to try to control that. Complete tangent. But to think about that. Yeah, to think about that, right? That a woman, not only does she have to get over the hurdle of all of her learned thoughts and reactions from our culture and likely her upbringing to take the risk in the first place, she has a bigger hurdle if she takes the risk and fails, because the perception for, I think, a woman doing that, again, is so much worse and scarier than if a man did.
I cannot begin to tell you how many women I have met that have introduced themselves in some icebreaker fashion that they are a recovering perfectionist.
Yeah.
Makes me super sad.
But great that they're recovering.
Oh,
Thank
indeed,
God.
indeed. And on that positive note, we're going to take a quick break to recognize our sponsor.
Hi, Barbie here from Moonray, husband and wife indie pop duo. If you enjoy the intro music, we invite you to listen to our debut EP, Honeymoon, streaming now on all platforms. Visit www.moonray-music.com for more.
A thank you to our sponsor, and we are back, and we're talking with Gloria Chan about mindfulness. Gloria, what's mindfulness? Just spill it out. Just tell us all the things about what it really means, because in my mind, it means like I have to be practicing like meditation, or I have to constantly be thoughtful of everything.
Mindfulness, the definition, is the deliberate, non-judgmental awareness of the present moment.
Ooh, girl, you said non-judgmental.
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to break that into kind of two core tenets. One really big tenet of being mindful is being present, which means mentally present. I'm not predicting the future. I'm not ruminating on the past. I'm not going through my to-do list. My brain and my mind are where my body is, which sounds really simple, but I think for many of us is incredibly difficult to practice. That is one aspect of mindfulness that has all kinds of benefits emotionally and physically. The second core tenet of mindfulness is non-judgmental awareness, which, non-judgmental, it's funny. I feel like it's ironic because we have even judgment towards the word non-judgment. Inception of judgment in our society.
Right, for all of the recovering perfectionists out there, they're like, non-judgmental? Hold on.
Yes. Just sliding into self-talk of non-judgment means I'm going to turn into just a loaf of a human being all of a sudden and overindulge. Practice of non-judgmental awareness. In both mindfulness as well as just behavioral psychology, we recognize that almost all of our reactions, emotions, thoughts come up for us based on some past experience that the brain learned, where in mindfulness, the practice of non-judgmental awareness means, okay, I'm feeling myself have this reaction. I know my brain learned it in the past. Where did I learn that? Okay, based on here and now, is this reaction really relevant and productive to my here and now? Or is this just my brain kind of kicking up a autopilot reaction because the adaptation worked well that past time I learned it? That's the second core tenet of mindfulness that I think is harder to practice and harder to learn, but provides so many more long-term benefits to us when it comes to the transformational, life-changing stuff of mindfulness that you hear people talk about, but that is not necessarily only going to be closing your eyes and meditating on a rock in Bali, right? Which I think is somewhat what popular culture might have distilled it into for just quick hit perceptions.
Sure.
And I think self-doubt is an area where that, especially the non-judgmental awareness, is huge. But obviously the presence is required for us to be mentally present enough to say, oh, I'm spinning in a vortex of reactions right now. And then the non-judgmental awareness to be able to dive into it.
Talk to me a little bit about the cognitive awareness practice that you kind of briefly mentioned a moment ago.
Yeah. Recalibrate is primarily a workplace mental wellness service provider. And a big thing we focus on is trying to make things accessible, right? We recognize that talking about mindfulness and meditation can feel a little bit inaccessible because there are all kinds of hairy connotations around being woo-woo or soft or fluffy. And so when we talk mindfulness, we really want to focus a lot on the kind of neuroscience and behavioral science behind it. And a different concept we term mindfulness is around just cognitive awareness, right? Mindfulness in and of itself, when we're using just more scientific terms, is becoming more cognitively aware of all the subconscious stuff that happens for us. We have so much that's autopiloted and wired into us, from breathing to blinking, but to also perceiving this behavior as good or bad, perceiving this person as a jerk or an admirable person. And we want to bring more conscious cognitive awareness to those subconscious psychological and physical processes we have moment to moment, so that instead of being kind of trapped in an autopilot mode of previous learnings that we've had, that we can start to say, okay, no, that's not the best reaction for right now. We're going to choose something new. And that's where true growth and really neuroplasticity in the brain actually growing and having new neural pathways form, that's where all of that is found.
So I feel like you kind of told us just a little bit about how being mindful affects your brain, forming new neural pathways.
Yeah.
That sounds like a benefit
Yeah.
of practicing mindfulness.
Yeah.
Are there other benefits?
Absolutely.
I assume.
Yeah. The biggest one that I think probably many of our listeners have heard is its ability to combat stress. Stress for us is a very involuntary immediate reflex. It's the fight or flight response that was evolved into humans many, many eras ago, when humans were still living in tribes and in physical danger a lot, right? The fight or flight response is meant to kick in ASAP to have us be on the defense, to be able to run faster or fight harder. The brain is evolved in a way where incoming information that our brain is subconsciously scanning all day long has to go through a first gatekeeper that we like to call the jumpy guard dog of the brain. The scientific term is the amygdala. The amygdala's sole job is to take incoming information and flag it as safe or dangerous.
Oh.
And
Green light, red light.
exactly. Most of our dangers nowadays are psychological, right?
Yeah, we don't have to run from tigers
Right.
anymore.
It's a crappy email. It's self-comparison. It's thinking we're not enough, where the amygdala then takes that in and says, danger, fight or flight response. And so
Or freeze now.
right.
We got
or
freeze.
Yep, exactly. And we'll coordinate our body into that response. The fight or flight response in and of itself, that stress response, has all kinds of physical body stuff that is not healthy for us when prolonged, such as faster heart rate and higher blood pressure, which is great for running from a tiger temporarily. But when we're sitting in it 8 hours a day, our cardiovascular system wasn't built to sit in that all day. It was built to temporarily do that for a temporary threat. But when it's all day long, that's where we see it start to break down. Muscular tension is another huge one, right, that we can all relate to. That's part of the fight or flight response because our muscles kind of temporarily tense to protect ourselves from injury or someone coming at us. But again, muscles weren't built to be tensed up all day long. They were meant to flex and to stretch. But because most of us are subconsciously stressed out all day long, muscles start to break apart. We get lockjaw, we get the muscle and the back pain, we get all of this stuff. The brain is also hugely affected under that stress response. One big thing that many of us can again relate to is that we'll get less good quality sleep and we'll become more emotionally dysregulated. Serotonin is the chemical that regulates our sleep quality as well as our emotional cycles. When we're in that fight or flight response, the brain reads we're in danger. So we have to be on alert and hypervigilant and not worried about anything besides our survival, right? Deprioritize everything else. And so anytime cortisol is present in the body, serotonin can't fire because the brain doesn't want us to be sleepy or wasting time emotionally regulating. It wants us to be hypervigilant and on the defense. And this is why when we're chronically stressed, it's so hard to get quality sleep or even fall asleep, and why we're emotionally edgy and snappy AF, because the brain perceives danger and wants us to act out in that way, right? But it's not a great response for psychological danger, which requires a lot of complexity, which requires our rational brain to talk to our emotional animal brain. But in that stress response, it's only the really animal reflexive brain online. A lot of people have trouble accepting that. So the best example I can give around that brain chemistry, how the rational brain becomes less integrated, less resourced when we're stressed out. Think about days where you have a really complex problem that has high urgency and you are stressing about the answer all day long and you can't think of anything. And then you finally call it a day and go home and you jump in the shower or you go for a run or even kind of take a nap, right? And it's in the moment in the shower or on the run or when you're falling asleep that you get this genius floodgate of ideas all of a sudden.
Yeah.
That is that brain chemistry at work, right? When we are locked in a stress response and that fight or flight response, our brain's de-resourcing that rational part of the brain because it thinks we're in imminent danger and only wants animal reflexiveness online. But when we finally go home and jump in the shower and start to relax, the brain reads, okay, the imminent danger has left. We can start to recalibrate the brain. The rational brain can come back online. And that's where all of that complex, good juju thinking pops up for us. And so that's not only such a big benefit in the brain and the body that mindfulness can provide. So essentially, the research of mindfulness is that mindfulness has been proven over decades of research to biochemically counteract all the major aspects of a stress response, giving us the voluntary toolbox to counteract an involuntary response, right? Because it's not that we want to turn off stress. That stress response is very necessary for making sure that we don't
Die.
Yeah, we don't get hit by a car or go touching stoves for fun.
Exactly.
But it becomes less productive of a response when it's feedback that feels crappy or that our feelings are hurt, right? When we react defensively and self-protectively, that ends up hurting more than it ends up helping because we're not being rational and we're just on the defense.
It's so fascinating to hear about how our lizard brain is so hardwired to protect us that it hurts us.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad that we have these 21st century tools to be able to combat our brain's own protection mechanisms that are just not quite up to date with where we are in society and civilization.
I love that you said that it's an update, right? That it's an update. That's a way that we create an analogy when we're in our workplaces educating a lot. Because I think it's really hard for us as a top dog human species to think that anything within us could be self-sabotaging or that anything that's a protective reflex could actually be bad for us. Because we have been kind of untouchable as a species for so long, and we've done things like create the iPhone and Alexa and et cetera. But the reality is that our human brain is kind of catching up to what life looks like now, where it hasn't fully realized that we're not in physical danger all the time, and that psychological danger requires a different response. And we're kind of living out, I believe, the beginning of that evolution of the mind without changing the behavior and confirming that that helps us evolve into more advanced human species, right? The brain has no reason to change the behavior and evolve, but it takes a very long time for that to happen. And it was millions, many millions of years ago that the brain evolved that first fight or flight response for physical threat. And it was only in comparison kind of recently that we entered a place of creature comfort where we didn't have a lot of physical threat. The Industrial Revolution just happened a few hundred years ago. I mean, that is a blink of an eye in comparison to human evolution. And so I think we have to remember that although we have a lot of stuff automated in our brains and our bodies for that, that the automations aren't always going to be what helps us thrive in life. It's just going to be a reflex sometimes.
Definitely. I think a big challenge that we're facing now as a society is the rapid pace of technological change. And with things changing so rapidly, I mean, they were so different from when we were children. I can't imagine what our grandparents or our great-grandparents would think if they fast forwarded to right now and
Yeah.
saw us all walking around with tiny handheld computers, talking to a computer lady telling us how to get to the drive-thru or whatever it was.
Right. Yes.
We have so many advances and they've gone so quickly. It's no surprise that our brain can't keep up and that it's hindering us in unhealthy ways.
Yeah, because it's not only about adapting, right? It's about adapting well. And there are better adaptations than others when it comes to the long term.
So I infer that you face some challenges with some of your clients in sharing how difficult it is for our brain to take care of itself in this new way. What other sort of myths or misconceptions are you dealing with in regards to helping people, in helping professionals overcome self-doubt, self-sabotage, imposter syndrome, and that ever-pervasive perfectionism?
So one big misconception specific to what we're talking about today, which is self-doubt and that self-criticism. I think one big kind of floating myth that we see out there is that we can just kind of toughen up and white knuckle through our own self-doubt, right? Which causes us to kind of repress it and push it down, or to call it names and say, oh, that's silly, that's stupid, that's weak. Why am I talking to myself like that?
So where do we begin our practice of mindfulness? What's a baby step that I could take today? What's the next step that I could take tomorrow to start being more aware and mindful of the things that my brain is telling me that are not necessarily helpful?
One place to start is really kind of working on that non-judgmental awareness. So much of our self-doubt and self-critical voices come up because they're a learned protection. We learn that if we doubt ourselves or talk down to ourselves or predict the worst case scenario, things will be safer. Something that's probably a little bit lighter weight when it comes to imposter syndrome and how we learn that. The feeling, right, of not belonging and being found out. That, I think, is something core to many of our childhoods, where when you're a kid, you're kind of just figuring stuff out. And childhood is kind of this discovery phase where you're just kind of faking it or trying things out and dabbling, but it's also a phase where you figure out where you belong. And I think for many of us as kids too, right, you try to fit in by putting on a certain set of behaviors or clothes or toys. And there's always the underlying learned mental schema, the memory that, well, make sure you're on the lookout, because if you trip up, if you don't wear the right thing, if you don't say the right thing, if you don't act the right way, you might not belong and you might get found out. I think that's a really core feeling that gets kind of automated in us, right? And anytime we're coming into situations of belonging or growing, that memory comes up and pops up for us. And to just be able to know and to learn where some of these roots are for ourselves is where we start to bring that subconscious memory more into the conscious brain so that we can choose a different reaction versus just going to it. So with that practice of non-judgmental awareness, we actually like to have people look at news headlines or even book covers, because it's a little bit lighter weight way to start diving into your reactions. A lot of your reactions will kind of bring you onto tender spots that can be heavy. And so we'll have people actually look at headlines or book covers and run through 4 questions. One question is, what is my reaction? Just naming it right away. 2 is, how do I feel that reaction in my body? How do I notice it? And really noticing what your body feels like. 3 is asking myself, have I reacted like this before? Is it a pattern for me? And the very last question is asking, where might I have first learned or adapted this reaction in the first place? That way we can start to bridge the gap between where we learned that first reaction of, this self-doubt is going to help me, this self-criticism or negative self-talk is going to keep me safe, right? So that we can start to bridge the gap between the past where that adaptation might have helped us to the present where it's not helping us. So many of us rationally know that our negative self-talk does not help us, but we still do it because it is subconsciously so sticky. And that's because a lot of times we're having just a felt memory, and the memory is being felt from the past. And we don't kind of get educated on the fact that memories don't necessarily have to have pictures and words to them. That's an episodic memory. So many memories are just felt memories where it comes up. But because it feels so real and true, we just act on it. And then we get caught in the continued conundrum of, I keep acting in this way, but I know it's not good for me. If we can consciously go through the step-by-step of this reaction came from the past, we turn on the part of the brain that puts time into context and helps us realize we're in a different place, pull us out of that memory, and give us the conscious awareness that we can choose something different right now instead of just reacting. These are the little bits of mindfulness that have us able to choose a response instead of just reacting, but with the mindful presence and non-judgmental awareness, right? We put a little bit more room between the stimuli and the response, where instead of just reflexively reacting based on something that's autopiloted for us, we can say, okay, this is probably an autopilot, outdated software response.
Right.
We're updating the software now.
Give me another example of one of the intentional thoughts or feelings that we can start feeling in our practice of mindfulness.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into self-compassion. Compassion is something that I think gets a bad rap because it feels too soft or fluffy, but it can be very powerful and motivating. When we talk about practicing self-compassion, I like to recommend people make it as simple as talk to yourself and treat yourself like you would a loved one in the same scenario. Normally, we're a lot more hard on ourselves than we would be to anyone around us. So if we just shift the context, start talking to ourselves like we would a loved one, you end up having so much more room for context of your situation and context of just being a human. Instead of making it, I'm the best or I'm the worst, it just becomes, I'm a human, and you can start to deal with and take action on reality versus really clinging to these extreme polars of not reality, of needing to be the best or the worst that leave you in a place of taking action against something that's not going to help you. Instead, you can kind of recalibrate to the middle and say, all right, I'm a human. This was reality. What do I do to make it better? Which is where we find our resilience and our growth at the end of the day.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much. Do you have any resources that you would recommend to our listeners to check out in regards to developing a mindfulness practice?
Yes. One obvious one is reaching out to Recalibrate for either a corporate or a personal workshop. The second favorite I have is a book called Wherever You Go, There You Are by Jon Kabat-Zinn. He's kind of the Western world founder of mindfulness, and it's a great, easy read that you can pick up and put down at any point.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we are going to wrap up our episode today with a Femme fact. And history's limitations on women's rights never cease to amaze me, especially in regard to their career options. Gloria, can you guess what year women's enrollment in United States medical schools surpassed that of men?
Oh, God. 2016?
17. You were so close. 2017. So 3 years ago,
Horrifying.
Up until 3 years ago, men outnumbered women for enrollment in medical schools. In 1965, only 1 in 10 United States medical students were female. And 100 years before that, most medical schools did not admit women at all. So let's throw this back to Athens, Greece, circa 4th century CE, where it had become illegal for women to practice medicine, owing to the fact that women's dominance in midwifery left lots of dudes feeling pretty uncomfortable about the reproductive power wielded by women at the time. So they made the medical practice illegal to women. That is until a lady by the name of Agnes entered the field with a passion to help people with a particular affinity for flashing, and more on that later. It is unclear whether Agnes is a figure of history or a folktale. Nevertheless, her legacy as the first female physician and gynecologist has been used to inspire women to practice medicine for ages. Agnes received her medical education under the supervision of Herophilus, one of the early anatomists of Greece. But there was one catch. She could only receive the training as a dude. So that being said, she ended up cutting her hair. She dressed like a dude to comply with these ancient gender restrictions, and she successfully studied medicine and moved back to Athens as a physician. One day, Agnes heard a labored woman screaming in agony. Still posing as a man, she rushed to help the woman, but the woman refused to help her because she didn't want a man delivering her baby. So in order to prove her womanhood, Agnes lifted up her clothes and exposed herself and winning the trust of this woman, as one would do after flashing them, right? Agnes was able to successfully fool her male counterparts in her home city for some time. So much so that when her popularity grew among her female patients, who at that point knew her secret, and I imagine we know how she showed them, her rival physicians accused her of seducing the women of Athens. As accusations of her unprofessionalism grew, so did her impatience. Agnes decided she would no longer be questioned for her ethics and ventured to prove to the courts that she was not seducing her female patients. And she did that via the familiar and seemingly favorite technique of lifting her tunic in front of a jury to prove that she was, in fact, a woman. Shortly thereafter, she was indicted for breaking the law, and not for indecent exposure, but for practicing medicine as a woman. However, the women of Athens came immediately to her defense. Their testimonies were so powerful, so convincing that the jury acquitted her, then revoked the law criminalizing female physicians in Athens. The rest, my fiery and equally daring friends, is history. I'd like to take this moment to pay gratitude and respect to all the physicians and healthcare workers putting their lives on the line during the COVID-19 pandemic. Y'all are making history with your unwavering bravery, much like Agnes. To the ladies and the gentlemen working on the front lines, on behalf of HERdacious, thank you for all that you do. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in on today's episode. Gloria, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a wonderful, wonderful treat.
Thank you. And thank you to all the listeners as well.
Be safe, be well, and be bold.